Okay, is vaping worse than smoking? The short answer is probably not. Vaping is probably less harmful than cigarette smoking. We know from chemical analysis that the types of chemicals that are found in vaping are less toxic than the chemicals that are found in cigarette smoke. So we can infer or conclude from that that vaping is less harmful. And certainly some of the preliminary data show that. What we don't know is the long-term consequences. Vaping just has not been around that long, and it will take a long time for us to know what the true health consequences of vaping are. So my advice is just don't vape. We just don't really know. And although it's tempting to say it's less harmful, that's just saying it's less harmful, not that it's not harmful. Vaping is a very controversial topic. At first glance, we think that it is less harmful than cigarette smoking. You're not inhaling smoke that comes from tobacco combustion. And if you actually look at those chemicals, a lot of the cancer-causing agents or carcinogens are not in the vapor that you inhale when you're vaping. So at first glance, there's evidence that it is less harmful than cigarettes. That doesn't mean it's not harmful. And one of my real concerns, and I think a concern of a lot of us in the public health sphere, is that vaping has several potential problems. First of all, we know that it is a mechanism for delivering nicotine, which means that people will get addicted to nicotine. And nicotine addiction is very difficult to quit. Once you're addicted, very hard to quit. So vaping is just another way to become rapidly addicted to nicotine. The second problem is that we know from analysis that the inhaled components do have chemicals that are toxic to the lungs, toxic to the body, and can potentially cause cancer. Even though we don't have the data right now, the way I explain it to people is that it takes a long time for us to really know whether something is harmful. It took us probably 50 years to figure out that cigarette smoking caused cancer, and vaping has only been around for maybe 10 years or less. I think it will be a generation before we know the full health impacts of vaping. I mean, if you think about it, you take a teenager who started smoking 5 years ago, cigarettes, a pack a day, they're fine, they're an athlete, they're performing well, no health consequences. And they won't really see any health consequences for another 20 or 30 years. That's when they'll start to develop circulation problems, emphysema, cancers another 10 or 20 years down the road. So for us to be able to look at vaping and say, well, 10 years on, it doesn't really look that bad, I think is a little naive. It'll take us 20 to 30 years before we see the real health impacts of vaping. And we know from chemical analysis that there are a lot of chemicals in that stuff they inhale that can cause damage to the lungs, to the heart, to the circulation, and who knows what else. Unfortunately, we really don't have good data on the long-term health consequences of vaping simply because it hasn't been around for that long. There's been a lot of data looking at the chemicals that are present in vaping. And one of the challenges there is that there are so many different manufacturers, there's no standardization, there's no regulation. And so different products will have different chemicals within them. Some of them will have metals from the different filament that's used to vaporize the solvent, and the different solvents have different chemicals, have different flavorings. So there's thousands of different agents within all of these different devices. And to understand the long-term health consequences of those can be challenging. We know that some of them are toxic to the lungs, and there have been data about what we call the acute effects. In other words, what happens right away. If you measure lung function, we know that lung function declines people who vape. What's really unknown are the long-term health consequences, and that, unfortunately, there's no way to speed up the research on that. That will take years. What precautions can you take? Well, don't vape. That's really the only precaution. It's not like wearing a filter or something like that is going to reduce the health impact of vaping. Tobacco use can contribute to the development of cancer in a variety of ways. First of all, there are different ways in which tobacco is used. There's tobacco chew, there's cigarette smoking, and those each have their own mechanisms. Essentially, tobacco is a plant that has a lot of chemicals in it, and many of those chemicals can cause cancer, especially when they're burned and then you inhale the smoke. The smoke have a lot of chemicals in them that cause cancer. Those are called carcinogens. So exposure of the tissues in our body to those cancer-causing chemicals over time creates changes in the DNA. Those changes in the DNA can contribute to uncontrolled growth of cells. That's what cancer is. It's uncontrolled growth of tumor cells. So any tissues that come in contact with those cancer-causing agents can develop cancers. So for example, if you're chewing tobacco and the tobacco rests against the inside of your mouth, the tissues along the inside of your mouth are constantly exposed to these chemicals, and you can develop cancers of the mouth, the oral pharynx, and the tongue and the throat. If you're a cigarette smoker, anywhere that those chemicals come in contact with your body can develop cancers. So people who smoke, the inhaled smoke comes in contact with the mouth and the tongue and the throat and the lungs. And so smokers develop lung cancers, cancers of the mouth and the throat. They can also develop cancers of the upper GI system in the esophagus because some of the chemicals get swallowed and exposed to the esophagus. And then the other place where smokers develop cancers is in the urinary bladder. And that's because these chemicals are absorbed into our bloodstream, excreted into the urine, and then concentrate in the bladder and sit there in the bladder, constantly exposing the lining of the bladder to carcinogens or cancer-causing chemicals. So the use of tobacco, whether you're chewing it or smoking it, exposes your body to cancer-causing chemicals over a wide spectrum of the body, from the mouth to the throat, to the esophagus, to the lungs, and even to the bladder. So smoking causes lots of different diseases related not only to damage to the lungs, but also damage to the circulation, because the smoke that we inhale, the carbon monoxide, causes damage to blood vessels. So one of the immediate benefits of quitting smoking is improved oxygen delivery to our organ systems, improved circulation, improved heart function, and improved lung function, because our lungs are lined by little tiny hairs that move to clean stuff out of the lungs. When we inhale dust particles from the environment, those little hairs move the dust particles out of our lungs. And when we smoke, the toxicity of that cigarette smoke actually causes those hairs to stop working very well. And that's why smokers can develop a cough. So as soon as you quit smoking, within 24 hours, the lining of our lungs begin to work better. And one of the things that smokers will notice when they quit smoking is that within about a week or two, they'll start coughing up a lot of stuff. And that's because the lining of their lungs is starting to work better. It's healthier. So the lungs are healthier, your circulation is healthier, your heart is healthier. And those changes happen within days to weeks of quitting smoking. One of the big questions that people ask though is, what about cancer risk? Of course, people who've been smoking for a long time are at increased risk for cancer. And unfortunately, when you quit smoking, the cancer risk does not go down. And that's why we recommend that even former smokers get screened regularly for lung cancer. What does happen is that the risk of cancer stops going up. So if you keep smoking, your risk of cancer continues to grow and increase. Once you stop, the cancer risk stays the same. Unfortunately, it doesn't really go down over time, but it doesn't keep going up, and that's a real benefit. Smoking cessation has been a goal for many, many years. Nicotine addiction is incredibly difficult to quit. It's more difficult than any other drug addiction. That includes heroin, narcotics, cocaine. Nicotine addiction is very difficult to quit, and there's even a genetic component to it. So smoking cessation is complicated. The first thing is that you have to be committed to doing it. If you don't want to quit smoking, you're not going to quit. So the first thing is to make sure you want to quit. And the best ways to do that are to think not only about the benefits for you, but the benefits for the people around you. Your family, your kids, everyone around you will benefit from your smoking and your being healthier. So if you can quit smoking, that's a benefit not only to you, but to the people around you. And if that can't motivate you to quit smoking, then you're not going to be able to quit. So once you've decided you can quit, there are a lot of resources. The State Tobacco Fund has a lot of programs for smoking cessation. There are online courses, there are phone support, there are in-person courses, there are prescription drugs that can help to quit smoking, nicotine patches that can help to quit smoking. And then there are other strategies that are less well proven, but some people find helpful. For example, hypnosis and acupuncture. People often use those. Whether they actually work or not is a little bit in the eye of the beholder. But listen, any strategy that's going to help you quit is worth it. The first is that you got to decide to quit. One strategy that people have used, and that's a little bit controversial, is switching over to vaping, using non-cigarette nicotine sources through vaping. There are some data that people who switch to vaping use less cigarettes, and there may even be some data that they can eventually quit. But the problem is you're trading one nicotine source for another, and it's not clear that vaping is a particularly healthy approach. And so people who quit cigarettes and now are vaping may have traded one vice for another without actually achieving smoking cessation. So we generally recommend quitting smoking through medications, through counseling, through online forums, and through peer support groups. Exposure to secondhand smoke is a known cause of lung cancer. About 20% of people who get lung cancer were never smokers. About 20% are people who are still smoking, and about 60% are people who quit smoking. So among those 20% who are never smokers, sometimes it's just bad luck and bad genetics, but sometimes it's exposure to other environmental carcinogens. One of the most common being secondhand smoke. So people who are exposed to secondhand smoke, like people who work in a bar or a restaurant where there is active smoking, or in a confined place where other people smoke, or who grew up in a household where people were smoking, they're exposed to secondhand smoke and are at increased risk to develop lung cancer. And that's one of the reasons that there's been so much advocacy over the last 20 to 30 years to limit secondhand smoke exposure, to limit smoking in public places like restaurants and bars. When I was growing up, I remember taking airplanes and people would smoke on the airplane, and you had the non-smoking section in the back of the airplane, which really wasn't much benefit. But now there's no smoking on airplanes. So limiting smoking in public places has been a tremendous progress in terms of limiting the cancer risk. Secondhand smoke is unfortunately unavoidable, but if you can avoid it, it's good for your health. A little bit of secondhand smoke is not going to make a difference. It's that exposure to continuous repeated secondhand smoke, like working in a bar, that is going to increase your risk. There's been a lot of advocacy and progress in terms of tobacco control measures, and that's because they work. For example, the warnings on cigarette packages, there's good data that putting those on cigarette packages help to reduce smoking. The other big effect is from tobacco taxes. There's very clear data that raising taxes on cigarettes reduces cigarette smoking. So there are a number of public health measures that have been undertaken over the last several years by advocacy groups such as the American Lung Association that have had a clear impact on reducing smoking. Also, smoking that targets youth has been a real issue, and prohibiting the sale of cigarettes to youth, prohibiting the sale of cigarettes within a certain distance of schools, prohibiting advertising that's targeting youth, those have all been very effective in reducing tobacco use and smoking.